Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Daniella Mascarenhas, pronouns she, they. I am an assistant professor of political science at Xavier University of Louisiana in New Orleans. And I'm really excited to keep talking with you about how C4AA encourages joyful resistance and how I, as a professor, have used that. So there may be a question of how I got here, how I connected with C4AA. I connected with C4AA because I was part of the inaugural cohort for the Unstoppable Voters Faculty Fellowship. And so what that meant is in the spring semester and the fall semester of 2024, I, along with other college educators nationwide, worked with C4AA materials, brought them into our classroom, and we helped students especially focus on voting work and how they can have joyful resistance and creative aspects of voting work. Um, the way that I structured my classes in the spring semester, I did prototypes with my students, kind of brainstormed ideas. And then in the fall, my students actually implemented several of these activities that they came up with. So I will say a little bit about how I had to frame that first for my students. I had to sort of bridge this idea of joy and resistance working together. And I especially drew on familiar cultural things to do that for my students. First of all, I am teaching in New Orleans as an educator, and I am also at a historically Black university in New Orleans. And so I use those examples to make this very real for my students to think about how joy and resistance can work together. So New Orleans obviously is a it's well known for its joy, right? We're a city that's built on joy for our jazz, our music, our parades, Mardi Gras, our French Quarter and our Bourbon Street. But New Orleans is also a city that has resistance built into it. New Orleans is the birthplace of the case Plessy versus Ferguson, which affirmed segregation in the United States, but it was actually an activist organization, the Citizens Committee, that kind of spurred this case so that it could be considered. We are a city that is still dealing with the after effects of Hurricane Katrina. We just came up on our 20-year anniversary of that. We are also a city in a state that has, we also have a history of segregation. This is where Ruby Bridges broke the color line. But we are also currently in a city and a state that has several crises with it. Housing crises, insurance crises, healthcare crises, education crises. So we have a vibrant culture of resistance in New Orleans that coexists with our culture of joy. Additionally, I've made these two things real for my students by drawing on their own experiences. At an HBCU, I especially draw on my students' Black experiences. An experience that is at one point joy, celebration of the Black experience, but also resistance in the United States. And so I sort of activated these dual experiences and then showed students that these two ideas can exist together, right? Joy and resistance can exist together. So my work was very voting focused with students. And so in spring 2024, I had my students think about how they can intertwine culture, joy, and resistance. And they came up with a prototype for how to combat voter apathy by having a second line to the polls. Now, again, this isn't something my students actually did, but this was, I think, a great example of how you can have joyful resistance that is unique to a specific culture. A second line is a very New Orleans thing. Historically, it's called the second line because it is a jazz parade that happens after a funeral where people are singing and dancing in the streets. I have a picture, an example of what a second line looks like. And now they're sort of used for various celebrations in New Orleans. Bachelor parties, weddings, graduations, right? We'll all have kind of a second line. I had one at my own wedding. And so my students said, what if we did something like that? What if we created a second line that led people to the polls, that's culturally relevant to New Orleans, that has this joy element to it, but also has this resistance against voter apathy, right? Again, as I said, this was just a prototype, but this shows how my students were thinking about local culture, how they can infuse joy and civic engagement in the things that they do together. Um, Another example of my students thinking culturally is a video that they made. Um, my students were trying to get other students on campus to come out to a campus talk. And they decided to make a TikTok video. And I say that this is culturally relevant because they were speaking to sort of a youth audience that is very involved in TikTok culture. So they made this video that imitates a TikTok trend. Um, you have to have a very specific type of music. You have to have a very specific shot style when making these TikToks. You essentially have to show that you're speaking the language of those that are involved in the culture to be successful at these types of TikToks. And so they repurposed these TikToks to get people to come out for this campus talk on political issues. So I'll play the video for you so you can see it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's the way everything goes. Every time we're in control. If the sky is pink and white, if the ground is black and yellow, it's the same way you showed me. Hide my head, don't close my eyes halfway.
So pretty creative. And if you think about what they're trying to do, this activates people far more than, a flyer that they're putting up in the dorms. It's something that's relatable to their peers. They're using familiar concepts and appealing to their audience here. Again, another example, TikTok was a very big deal for my students. And so another example of my students kind of talking with youth culture language, they wanted to interview people, do a man on the street style interview to gauge people's feelings about the state of politics and the state of the upcoming election. And so this man on the street interview is like very, very common on TikTok right now, where someone comes up with a microphone and asks relatively inane questions most of the time. Things like, would you date me? Or, what's your favorite color or something. But my students kind of co-opted this format and asked people about how they feel regarding politics. They had props. Props are very common in these TikTok videos. Happy or sad faces or neutral faces. You can see one of my students there holding those props during the interview. And they essentially were getting people to think, how to get involved in this election, what their feelings are. So my students understood that you need to speak the language of the audience that you're trying to attract. You have to have some cultural relevance to the audience that you're trying to attract. And that makes it easier for your audience to kind of relate to the issues. I had my students fill out reflections. And so I have some evidence from some of these reflections that this worked for my students. As one student said, this project has shown me how creative approaches to complex issues make them relatable and encourage public support. So when you speak the same language of your audience, they can kind of understand the goals that you want. Another thing that my students focused on was joy, how to inject joy in this experience. So, for instance, some of my students came up with the idea of a community opinion board. They looked at the major topics that were ranked by public opinion for the upcoming election. And they created these boards where people could come up and write their opinions on them. If you scanned a QR code and you got registered to vote, you would get a bag of candy. They were playing music. They were encouraging like line dancing. It was very fun. It was very festive, and it was also very low stakes. People were dancing, as I said, figuring out how to get more candy. Even the spatial aspect of this community board encouraged kind of like fun. You were shoulder to shoulder with people reading different things that people were writing on the board. It got people thinking about how to approach political issues, but there was also a joy injected in that experience. Um, Finally, I have another example of joyful resistance. This was my students who created a political party. So they ran this event two times. They did it on campus, and this is also them at the historic Congo Square here in New Orleans. And at this political party, they did party games with a twist, a political twist, of course. They had a Guess Who game with candidates running on state, local, and federal elections. And you would get a fact if you were participating in this. You would get a fact, and you would have to guess who the candidate was. They also had a voter registration trivia raffle. So you would pull a raffle ticket, you'd get a trivia question related to voter registration, and you could win a prize. Same thing with their pin the pole game, which was a twist on pin the tail on the donkey. They had a map of New Orleans, and participants would guess where early voting locations were. If you were within a certain diameter of the location, you got a prize. The winners of all of these games got the prize of smart cookies. They were smart cookies, so they were able to get smart cookies as their prize. But losers walked away with something too, but it was a Dum Dum lollipop, and I'm sure you can guess why. And so my students figured out joy draws people in, right? And I could see that. I saw some evidence of impact even in their reflections. Here's testimony from one of my students' reflections. When creating this project, I tried to think of all the things that people enjoy doing. You want something engaging to encourage people to want to participate and learn. You want to attract your audience. One unintended consequence of joy or experience of joy that I saw my students having is joy in the process, joy for themselves. The creative process was an unexpected place of joy that I saw. Students really enjoyed working in collaboration. They enjoyed the creative aspects. They enjoyed creating something together. They enjoyed designing. There was art involved in this process. And again, my students reported that this was part of why they liked this type of work. It felt like a true team effort. They loved the collaboration. They said the creative process was fun. Recording the skits, having laughs, editing, including pop culture references, all of that was enjoyable. So joy is not just what you can deliver to your audience, it's also the experience of doing this type of artistic activism. So I also measured students' motivation to continue doing this type of stuff, and how it kind of affects them. What I found is 82% of my students reported some increased motivation for civic engagement. They want to get involved after doing a project like this. 95% of my students said that they felt more informed. There's a political knowledge effect in activity like this. And importantly, 82% of my students said that they would consider doing artistic activism again in the future, not just getting involved in civic engagement, but specifically artistic activism. They found that this was the most rewarding form of activism that they could do. So, taken together, I think joyful resistance is a fantastic way, an effective way to become civically engaged. It attracts your audience. It brings joy to that audience. People are able to relate to the issues that you put on the table. It builds support for whatever issue you have. And it also creates lifelong artistic activists. People who are involved in this type of work want to continue doing this type of work. So I hope that my evidence convinces you that this is a great form of activism and that joyful resistance is beneficial in many ways. Thank you.